Granger.
Thank you very much. Secretary Panetta and General Dempsey, I want to thank you, and we all do, for the very strong, clear message you gave about sequester. You can see you're very sympathetic up here, but it is, there are members of Congress that are saying this is what's going to happen, and for you to be able to say this is the seriousness of it, this is what the cost will be to our national security, is just extremely important, and so thank you for that. I have an issue and then a short question. The issue that I'd just like Secretary Panetta you be aware of, you made a statement that I certainly agree with, and that's that we need to maintain a strong guard and reserve, and which is one of the reasons I want to bring this to your attention, because the Air Force has a plan to move C-130s out of Texas. And I'm concerned that that plan is not a good plan for the taxpayers. It's not a good plan for the warfighter. The squadrons were the first to respond after Katrina, and it's essential for the Gulf Coast disaster response efforts. The plan is to move that out of Texas to Montana without trained pilots. So there'll be a time when it will be a poor use of taxpayer dollars, but also will leave an essential capability during the training time. My concern about it is history of the Air Force not doing the cost-benefit analysis, that they haven't looked at the cost repeatedly. I just recently received a GAO study that I requested, and once again it confirmed the Air Force wasn't doing their due diligence. So I would really appreciate your looking into that and see if it really will be cost effective. My question, General Dempsey, has to do with some statements that you made. It's a situation in Egypt having to do with our NGOs that are there now going on to, I think, 6 weeks. And we all, I think, know that it's a really very serious situation. The Congress is very aware of it, and Ambassador Patterson has been very active, and we've talked almost daily about this situation. My question has to do with the funding, the military funding for Egypt, and I understand that you made some statements about what the impact would be of cutting off our aid, our military aid to Egypt, which is growing, something that in the Congress has been talked about more all day. So could you address that?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. We have a history of when we use funding to separate ourselves from prior partners, nothing good comes of it. Because what essentially we do is we fence ourselves off from the next generation. I mean, to the extent that the SCAF has acted responsibly, and we could certainly debate which areas have been more responsible than others, but to the extent that they have, I'd like to believe it's partly because they've been partnered with us, coming to our schools, exchanging with us for 30 years, and I actually believe that. Cutting off aid and therefore cutting ourselves off from them means that the next generation won't have that benefit, and I don't know where that takes us, to tell you the truth. So I am always reluctant to come to some stark conclusion about cutting aid. I'm sure there's other ways to do it. I leave that to you. I hope you would take us in your advisement, but conditioning certain things. I mean, there have to be some consequences for the choices they've made. I fully agree with that. But, you know, we do have a very close partnership with them. They grant us great overflight rights. They grant us priority passage through the Suez Canal. I mean, we get things for our aid that truly we need. And before we simply cut it off because of this issue, I would certainly like to examine those. That said, I was over there 10 days ago, and I made it extraordinarily clear that this situation must be resolved. So I think we just have to work together to figure out the right path.
Good, and I appreciate your making that clear. There were many articles written that we were threatening to cut off aid, when what we were doing is explaining that in some of the aid, it's the law. And so we were trying to explain what our law was. So thank you very much for your attention to that.
On that subject, when President Mubarak was in charge of Egypt, he basically was a blocker for anyone attempting to attack Israel. The relationship between Mubarak and the Israelis might not have been very friendly, but at least it worked. What do you see the new regime in Egypt? Will they be protective of Israel? the same as the Mubarak era did?
To be determined, to tell you the truth, Chairman. I mean, we've had conversations about that with them. I will say that in a fascinating way, the mill-to-mill relationship between Israel and Egypt is probably as strong as I've ever seen it in the, let's say, 20 years when I've been involved with it. So it's building on a strong foundation, but when I say to be determined, I think we have to see where they've elected both houses now. They're getting ready to craft a constitution, elect a president, and we'll see where the civil government takes them.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to you all. I think we all look forward to working together to not only meet some of these tough budget choices, but also to understand what kind of impact it's going to have on our military today as well as our national security in the future. And so I wanted to start by just bringing up something I've been working on for some time now, and that has to do with the strategic dispersal of our nuclear aircraft carriers. Members of the subcommittee have heard me talk about this from time to time, but as you all know, when we went to an all-nuclear fleet of carriers, then we went on the East Coast from having 2 home ports to just 1 home port. And so the Navy did a study for 2.5 years, concluded that it was a strategic imperative to have 2 home ports on the East Coast because we have 3 on the West Coast. And I think, Mr. Secretary, it was your predecessor who said it's never been acceptable to have a single home port on the West Coast, and it certainly shouldn't be acceptable to have only 1 on the East Coast. So the Navy began the process to create a second home port for a nuclear carrier, but this budget doesn't have any money. It kind of has 0 money to continue that strategic imperative. So I think that's really more of a question for Secretary Mavis and CNO, but I wanted to bring it up because I think it's symbolic of a decision that I think all of us have certainly in the back of our mind, because when we look at the budget, we can't help but ask the question, are we making these decisions based on strategic needs, or are we trying to find the easiest way to save some money? And that's very important. You heard Chairman Young say, I don't think we ever ought to make decisions about national security based on politics or budgetary constraints. So I wanted to make that point, but before I ask a question about where we spend money or where we don't spend money, this is something I'd like to ask you, Mr. Secretary. Just when I read about the new strategic guidance, there are several fancy words about aggression and things. When I look back at the QDR we did a couple of years ago, it kind of reinforces the simple statement that we ought to be able, among other things, we ought to be able to fight, I think, 2 wars at one time, or defeat 2 nations or non-state aggressors at one time. And when you talk about strategic guidance, it's different. You defeat a major adversary, you stop aggression. And my kids always used to ask me when I would say something that I didn't quite think they'd understand. They say, Dad, would you unwrap that for me? So just talk about, how your department came to this new strategic guidance, what that means in real world terms about how we would deal with some of the situations we're dealing now. And then maybe most importantly, are you convinced that everything in this budget, there's some things you got to have in terms of assets, in terms of platforms, in terms of people, and does this budget really make sure that we have those assets as we go forward?
I'm going to ask Marty Dempsey to comment on that as well, because obviously we relied a great deal on our military chiefs to give us guidance with regards to this key issue. We from the very beginning, when we sat down, particularly with the combatant commanders, we said, we've got to have the capability of confronting more than one adversary at a time. And in many ways, that's always been the key. I mean, I know there's been talk about 2 land wars. The fact is, look, we had 2 land wars in these last 10 years, but in order to do that, we had to mobilize. We really didn't have the capacity, even though it may have been in the QDB and all the other things that they have, for planning. The reality was, when it came to it, we had to mobilize additional forces in order to be able to do that. And so our approach was, okay, let's assume we have to confront more than one adversary at a time. I mean, the more likely scenario is you're fighting a land war in Korea, and as I said, the Straits of Hormuz suddenly get closed by Iran, tries to take advantage of it. Do we have the capability to be able to address that kind of crisis and make sure we've got sufficient force able to deal with it, to deter it, and to make sure that we can defeat that adversary as well? The military said, we have got the capability to do that. We've got the air power, we've got the naval power located in the right places to be able to confront that situation. Can we address other challenges that might come up at the same time? And the key there is to recognize that we're in the 21st century, and we're going to be dealing with a kind of asymmetric kind of attacks that are going to be a lot different than what we've seen in the past. Our ability to use cyber, our ability to use space, our ability to use precision weaponry, all of that, those kind of new capabilities is going to give us the kind of advantage we need to have. In many ways, what I've said is we need to leap ahead of our adversaries. For example, China's developing, obviously, and adding more to their military. We have to have the capability not just simply to match them, we need to have the capability to leap ahead, to be able to have the kind of technology we need in order to deal with that. And that's where we put our investments.
The only thing I'd add, Mr. Secretary and Congressman, is that when we unwrapped the QDR and looked at some of the accounting rules that accrue from strategy. So we say we have to fight two conflicts, and we kind of name them, and then we look at accounting rules. There was a tyranny of language, actually, which your children would probably appreciate. And the tyranny of language was that we say we got to be able to do something in Korea. It's going to last X number of days. We need this much ammunition. Therefore, you need this many trucks to. And the next thing you know, you've got this incredibly large, cumbersome structure that is not as agile as what the Secretary has challenged us to find or to be. And so as we have unwrapped the two-war strategy, what I'll tell you is it was never all that it said it was, to be honest. And I was part of it, so I mean, it's a self-indictment. But the other thing about it was, in this century, it's actually quite imprecise, because the other insight that I shared earlier about this strategic seminar series that I'm running with the chiefs and combatant commanders is that if we're doing anything or two places, there's going to be a third, and that's the homeland. And we have to account for the structure required to stay here in the homeland for consequence management, relief, protection, and all of that. So it never was a two-war strategy. It really was always a three. And so what we've actually tried to do is now talk to ourselves about how to take the resources available, change the way we apply them to achieve the same ends. And we know we can do that, and we're continuing to work toward that end.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.